Chapter 12 is an introductory chapter to the nervous system. So the next 4 chapters are on the nervous system and different parts thereof. The basic divisions of the nervous system are the central nervous system, brain and spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system, which includes ganglia, which are clusters of neuron cell bodies, also 12 pairs of cranial nerves, and 31 pairs of spinal nerves. Functions of the nervous system would include, first of all, to monitor stimuli. A stimulus is a change in the environment, either external or internal. Once that change in the environment is sensed by our sensory receptors, in this example, we are thirsty for water, we're looking at the glass of water, and that information is then sent to the central nervous system via sensory input. Information coming in towards the CNS is known as sensory or afferent. Once that information comes to your conscious brain, central nervous system, the next thing that happens is called integration, which means the brain will interpret the sensations, the sensory input, and will formulate a response to that incoming information. The motor output, or efferent division, would be the response to that sensory input. Motor or efferent output would then go from the central nervous system to the effectors to execute a response. Effectors are muscles and glands, smooth, cardiac, skeletal muscles, and various glands. This next slide, I'm not going to lie, is pretty scary, but I'll break it down for you. First, a couple of reminders. Sensory equals afferent means information coming towards the CNS. Motor or efferent is information outgoing from the CNS out. Think of efferent, E for efferent, E for exit. Exits the CNS, if that helps. 2 more terms to look at. Somatic, soma means body. In this context, structures outside of the ventral body cavities, basically skin, senses, and proprioception. Whereas visceral has to do with organs. Remember, viscera equals organs. Those structures would be within the ventral body cavity. Let's take a look at this weird diagram. First, please visually locate the blue arrows. And here we have somatic sensory. Somatic sensory. So sensory means going towards the CNS. Soma, body, means these are sensations from the skin senses, and proprioception, which has to do with the sense of self and basically has to do with stretch reflexes and skeletal muscles, which we will cover next chapter, I believe. Visceral sensory. What is viscera? It's another word for organ. So then sensations, or I should ask you, what sort of sensations do we get from our visceral organs? Pain, stretch. Here we have a stomach, maybe I ate too much, the stomach has stretched, there are sensations from that. That is also incoming or sensory information. Depicted in red arrows would be the outgoing motor or efferent information. Here again we have two subdivisions. Somatic motor. Somatic motor has as its effectors skeletal muscles. Somatic motor skeletal muscles. Therefore, these are muscles that we can control. Whereas visceral motor effectors are effectors that we cannot control at the conscious level. Those would be smooth muscles, cardiac muscles, and glands. The visceral motor division is also known as the ANS, which stands for the autonomic nervous system. Chapter 15, one of my favorites. The ANS, in turn, has two subdivisions. Sympathetic is the emergency mode. Parasympathetic is the rest and digest. ANS, visceral motor, whole chapter just on that. Nervous tissue is highly cellular. This slide is not from your book, but I chose it because it fairly dramatically shows the difference in size between the two categories of cells in the nervous system, which are neurons or nerve cells and supporting cells, which are called glial or neuroglial cells. Again, nervous tissue is highly cellular. However, there are only two types of cells, neurons and glial cells. Neurons are much larger than glial cells, and neurons cannot divide as can the glial cells, but neurons are the cells that are capable of responding to and initiating a firing or an action potential. That's physiology. I will cover a little bit of that as well. Basic structures of a typical neuron. 3 parts. Cell body, typically the biggest, not the longest. Cell body contains the nucleus. It also contains clusters of rough endoplasmic reticulum plus free ribosomes. Remember, these make proteins. And these clusters of RER and free ribosomes are called chromatophilic substance or Nissl substance. Chroma, color, philic, loving. These are structures that pick up or attract various dyes and therefore are highly visible with most staining techniques. Extending from the cell body are various arms. The tapering branches are called dendrites. They taper off, they branch, and these represent the primary receptive sites, meaning that the incoming impulses towards this neuron are usually through the dendrites. Dendrites, dendros from the Greek meaning tree. Think of a tree whose branches taper off, as do these dendrites. Extending from the cell body is a single very long process known as an axon. It starts off right off of the body with a little hill-like projection known as the axon hillock. The axon is a structure that usually generates and conducts this impulse or action potential. Impulse, nerve impulse, action potential, that's physiology. Don't worry about the chemistry. If you take a look all the way down the end of this axon, you will note that it ends up with axon terminals. Those are the structures that actually form the synapses. If you recall from our discussion of the neuromuscular junction, that would be essentially a synapse between the axon terminal of a motor neuron and the muscle fiber that it innervates. One more thing on the slide would be the blue bubbly things that wrap around the axon. These are the myelinating Schwann cells, which we will address again in just a bit. Classification of neurons. Two ways of doing this, structurally or functionally. The structural classification has to do with how many processes extend from the cell body. Multipolar, many processes. These would be motor neurons and most interneurons. Multi means many. Bipolar means two. Bipolar neurons are typically embryonic neurons. In the adult or postnatally, they are typically restricted to the retina portion of the eye and also part of the sense of smell, the olfactory system. Finally, we have unipolar or pseudo-unipolar neurons. Here, there's apparently only one extension coming off of the cell body, therefore uni. However, even that little stem is actually composed of two parts. So pseudo-unipolar means that it's falsely looking like a single process. Unipolar equals pseudo-unipolar, and that would be true for most sensory neurons. The second classification is according to the direction in which a neuron sends its message. The neurons that send messages towards the central nervous system, we already have learned that, would be sensory or afferent neurons. Neurons that transmit or send the action potential from the CNS out are called what? Motor or efferent. E for exit, exiting the CNS. Interneurons, as the name describes, are located between sensory and motor neurons. Typically, interneurons are contained or located completely within the central nervous system. The other category of cells of nervous tissue would be neuroglial or glial cells. These are supporting cells. They can divide, they cannot generate or respond to nerve impulses. They simply help the neurons, which cannot divide, and therefore are precious and need to be protected. Neuroglial cells serve to protect the neurons. There are two categories of neuroglial cells. Glia would be just fine. Glia, by the way, means glue, so they stick like glue around neurons. There are 4 different types of glial cells in the CNS and 2 in the PNS. The next slides will cover each one of these cells one at a time. Astrocytes, star-shaped. Astrocytes, CNS, are the most common glial cells in the CNS. They attach at one end to the neuron, depicted in a gold color here, At the other end, they reach out and wrap around capillaries. In doing so, they control the ionic environment of the neuron and increase blood supply to the neuron, and also regulate the levels of neurotransmitters. Remember, ACH is a neurotransmitter that we have already studied. Microglia are smaller. These are the least numerous glial cells in the CNS. These are small, mobile phagocytic cells, the cleanup crew. Oligodendrocytes myelinate axons or fibers in the CNS. Typically, one oligodendrocyte will myelinate several axons. Axon would be also called a fiber. What is the function of myelin or this myelination? The answer is to insulate the axon and to speed up the transmission of that action potential. Myelin sheaths are essentially wrappings of the cell membrane of those oligodendrocytes. What's the main chemical component in cell membranes? Lipids, fats. This fat structure, the myelin sheath, therefore, serves to insulate the fibers. Again, in this context, a fiber is an axon. Ependymal cells form an epithelial-like structure, and these ependymal cells line central nervous system cavities, including the ventricles of the brain and also the central canal of the spinal cord. They line these cavities and they help produce cerebrospinal fluid, CSF. Much more on CSF in later chapters. The glial cells of the PNS, peripheral nervous system, are two. Satellite cells, as shown in this drawing, will surround and protect the cell bodies of neurons, whereas Schwann cells are the myelinating cells of the peripheral nervous system. And they're shown in this diagram as the blue little bubbles. They insulate via the production of myelin sheaths. They insulate axons. This next slide summarizes some of the general terms that we will be looking at and using from this point on. Here we see a cross-section of the spinal cord, and the spinal cord being a central nervous system structure, remember CNS, brain, and spinal cord, will show gray matter and white matter. What is gray matter? It would be unmyelinated fibers and cell bodies of the neurons, interneurons, and also neuroglial cells. White matter, as the name implies, is white-ish. Why is that? Because it contains myelinated axons mostly. Myelin is what? Adipose tissue, which looks whitish. Again, neuroglial cells are present everywhere. On the left side of this diagrammatic, let's review the terms sensory or afferent incoming information, motor or efferent outgoing information. So we have a sensory or afferent fiber axon, motor or efferent fiber. Interneurons do what? They connect sensory to motor. Those are always, or usually, almost always, present completely within the CNS. Let's take a look at a spinal nerve. Here we see both sensory and motor components. When you have both sensory and motor components in a structure, we will call that a mixed structure. Mixed means both sensory and motor. What is a nerve? You probably have heard of the sciatic nerve, but what is a nerve? A nerve is a peripheral nervous system structure. Nerves are only present in the PNS. Nerves are essentially an organ-like structure, which are full of axons. Groups of axons are known as fascicles. What does that sound like? A fascicle within a muscle. Remember, in that context, a fascicle would be a group of muscle fibers. Within the nervous system, a fascicle would be a bunch of axons. Let's go back to the muscle. We have the 3 CTP coverings on the muscle, and those would be the epimysium, perimysium, going around fascicles, and the endomysium, CTP coverings of muscles. Let's look at this picture. Same thing. Covering or surrounding the entire named nerve is the neurium, not mysium. We're talking about nerves. Epineurium, CTP surrounding the entire nerve. Surrounding individual fascicles would be the perineurium, and the very thin CTP components that surround individual axons would be the endoneurium. Epi, peri, and endoneurium. Spinal reflex. Kind of a funny cartoon that I came across. What is a spinal reflex? Well, it's a rapid, predictable response to a stimulus. In this unfortunate cartoon, the healthcare provider is sitting way too close to the patient. They did a little tap on the patellar tendon, and what happened to the patient? The patient, well, they reflexively extended and kicked the healthcare provider. Unfortunately, this is a spinal reflex. It is conducted at the level of the spinal cord. The different components of a reflex arc would include, first of all, the stimulus. In this picture, it would be that awful looking nail going into the skin. That's a stimulus. Ouch. That information is received by receptors, carried towards the CNS via sensory neurons. Here we have an interneuron that then connects to the motor neuron, which goes to the what? Effector. And in that case, you're going to either remove your hand from the painful stimulus or move away from it in some other fashion. Two types of reflexes, depending on how many synapses. The less common one is a monosynaptic reflex, meaning just one synapse. We go from the stimulus, I've numbered the components, to a sensory receptor, to a sensory or afferent neuron, which synapses, mono, just one, directly to the outgoing motor or efferent neuron, which goes then to the effector organ. The only example of a monosynaptic reflex is the knee-jerk reflex that you saw in the first cartoon. Polysynaptic reflexes are more common. Same components with the addition of an interneuron. They're slightly more complicated because of the interneuron, equally effective, and examples would be the withdrawal reflex. Let's say in this example, you put your hand on a painful stimulus and you very quickly remove your hand from that painful stimulus. Question to you: what is the benefit of having this localized, more or less, reflex? And the answer is timing. When this response to a painful, potentially dangerous stimulus is immediate at the level of the spinal cord, you are potentially saving yourself from a bigger injury because of that rapid response. When this response occurs, just a fraction of a second later, the information about this painful stimulus will be quickly transmitted to the brain with a slight delay. That delay in timing will then buy you time to prevent further injuries. Again, this is an immediate response at the subconscious level, involuntary. Will you feel the pain? Yes, but just a fraction of a second later. Welcome to Neuroanatomy. This is just the beginning, the first of 4 chapters on the nervous system.